Hello and welcome to the lecture on masculinity studies. In this lecture we're going to take a look at the readings from Michael Kimmel, Phil Petrie, Messner, Drummond and Kenway, Fitzclarence, and Hasluck. So we're going to take a look at different notions of masculinity as well as other concepts which it may be connected to, and learn about how it has evolved as its own study, especially in relationship to and contrast from gender studies more broadly and feminism. So the goal here is that in the development of masculinity studies as its own field, right, so you can now actually become a major and get a degree in masculinity studies, which is pretty new. The notion here was to challenge what we have come to know as heteronormativity, right? So the norm, in a sense, meaning that we presume that everyone is heterosexual. And the reason that that is going to come out as being so central to masculinity studies is, I think, best captured by the first paper that you're reading this week by Michael Kimmel, right? And so this is going to be a series of concepts and framework, ways of understanding what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine, and thus what it means to be straight in terms of notions that are going to be antithetical to what it means to be a woman and what it means to be feminine, right? And so we're going to be tying up notions of one's sexual orientation here with sex and gender, which, as we learned in the previous weeks, is a result of that sort of essentialist, naturalist, or biological determinism as our sort of underlying assumptions or views of reality. So that is the sort of problem that these different views are going to be trying to tackle. But it's also going to, of course, underlie some of the more outdated conceptions of masculinity, as we'll see. So essentialism, again, is the idea that both sex and gender are really one and the same, and they are determined by our biology. And of course, this conception of biology, again, makes an incorrect description of nature in presuming that there are only two biological sexes. And then shooting off from that, the idea is that your sexual orientation would be heterosexual, right? That's that heteronormativity piece. And thus we assume that the opposites, in this case, attract to one another, right? And so one of the interesting offshoots of this is not only does it not accurately reflect reality in terms of both human and non-human animals and their sexual preferences, but it also has this sort of other interesting implication in that it doesn't allow sex acts, right? So we're not talking about your biological sex in this case, but actual sex acts, to be a utility of pleasure. They're really only seen as functioning for the purposes of reproduction, which I would hope one would think is in and of itself a very outdated sort of concept of, you know, why sex can be and is meaningful in our lives and in our expression of our own identity. But I think that some anthropological studies really show that, you know, the evolution of the sex organ, as we saw in one of our previous readings, does give some signifiers that it could be serving as a function for something other than reproduction, right? The location of the pleasurable parts of our sexual genitalia, right? Certain sexual acts that both humans and non-humans engage in that have absolutely nothing to do with the goal of reproduction, right? So there's just a lot of activity that occurs in nature that just goes far beyond the idea that sex is only for the purpose of reproduction, right? And so this essentialist view doesn't really allow for us to view sex in that way. It also, of course, doesn't allow for notions of gender, let alone sex or sexuality, to be socially constructed, right? Because we're seeing these things under a essentialist perspective as being fixed and already predetermined by nature. As a result, right, if one presumes that this is in fact an accurate description of reality, then we have this sort of normative implication that if this is how things are, then this is thus how they ought to be. And that makes it really difficult for individuals who are marginalized or oppressed by these views to fight against them, right? There's no room within these theories to push back against that oppression, since it is deemed to be the quote-unquote natural, or as we see, that's often conflated with what is morally right situation to be in. And so, as I hinted at, right, this is going to bring up an assessment of masculinity that really comes as an offshoot of the development of feminism over time. So in the coming slides, I have some more information, but what we're going to be looking at is really the development of men's studies, which emerged in the 1980s as its own area of research. So this is well after, decades after feminism had, been prevalent in academia for a while. And so, as we've discussed, feminism was not all-inclusive in its origin, and so it took a while for feminism as an academic discipline to consider, right, that men's gender might also too fall under some of the issues that feminism is trying to deal with. So we start to see this other area emerge in the 1980s, but it too, just like feminism did, started off with a rather narrow conception of what masculinity and what gender was, basing a lot of its views on sex role theory